The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man." And then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Have you ever been at a party or a group of people talking, and the conversation turns to the topic of who knows the most famous person? And then you start reciting your encounters with less famous people, and then someone knows someone who's more famous, and then you work yourself up, and pretty soon someone there knows someone famous or has had an encounter with someone famous. My wife lived next door to a neighbor named Peter Docter, who became the famous animator for the Toy Story movie. That's my claim to fame. Another claim to fame is my sister Laura is married to a Secret Service agent, and they had a personal photograph, family photograph, with George W. Bush that hangs above their fireplace. That's my closest encounter, I think, to famous people. And perhaps all of us have fantasized about having a famous friend, or fantasized about someone famous coming to their house, paying them a visit, coming to their party. For me, I've fantasized, I must admit, about one of my heroes, John Paul II, and imagining him coming to my party, showing up at my party, or coming to my wedding, or hearing about that I was going to be ordained and coming to my ordination. In today's gospel, Jesus, who himself is becoming famous, is invited to a party by a leading Pharisee. And it's probably one of these by invitation only parties. And the whole party is probably packed with a bunch of who's who folks. And at parties like this, everyone has one eye on who they're talking to and another eye on who is everyone else talking to, who's talking to who. A lot of folks are concerned about advancing their own status and increasing their own reputations. And at this party, it says that they were, quote, watching Jesus carefully. Jesus was pretty respected and famous by now. And one of the curses of this, that most of us have never experienced, is that everyone watches you very closely. Like if Pope John Paul II came to my party, I'm sure one eye would always, of each guest would be on John Paul II. as he was at that party. And while Jesus is there and everyone is watching him, he begins to speak. And I can imagine a hush descending on the party, and everyone stops talking to one another, and they start to listen. And then Jesus starts to talk about, of all things, parties. And first of all, he addresses himself to the guests. He says, "Don't presume and grab the seats of honor. What if someone else comes and the host decides," I'm paraphrasing, "to boot you out of that good seat because he thinks someone else is more distinguished than you? Then you would look like a fool. Your tail would be between your legs and you would have to return to a lower seat. Rather, wouldn't it bring you more honor if you had a little humility and were willing to take the lesser seat to begin with? And then the host would notice, and he would bring you up to a higher position. The last shall be first," Jesus says, "and the first shall be last. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted." Last Sunday, Father Erickson preached on the narrow gate, and he said that the narrow gate, or the gate to heaven, is narrow, and that if we're carrying a lot of baggage called sin, we won't be able to squeeze through the narrow gate into heaven. And so our job on earth is to reduce our sin baggage, get rid of that excess weight so that we can pass through the narrow gate into heaven. And when St. Peter meets us at the pearly gates, I imagine him saying to me, "Deacon Brewer, it's good to see you here, but your head is too big. That head is not going to fit through the narrow gate over there. You think too highly of yourself. You naturally grab the seats of honor when you can. You must understand," he'll say to me, "that the people on the other side of the narrow gate don't have big heads. And if you can listen closely, you can hear a big party going on at the other side of the narrow gate. And at that party, the people are not looking over their shoulders at who is talking to who. They're not concerned with the pecking order and getting ahead of someone else. They are loving the person in front of them, whether they're famous or not famous." And then I imagine St. Peter saying to me, "Deacon Brewer, do you see that health club next door? They specialize in head reduction. And you can check into that place by that drill sergeant, big drill sergeant that's standing over there." So in a nutshell, at the party in today's gospel, Jesus is urging everyone to be humble. He's urging everyone to stop grabbing for attention and prestige. And the next thing that happens at the party is, while he has everyone's attention, he turns his attention to the host of the party. And I can just see all eyes turn to the host and a gulp in the host's throat. I can see him start to twitch as Jesus starts to talk to him. What is Jesus going to say to the host of that party in front of everyone? Jesus says to him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your wealthy neighbors and all the other rich and famous people that will make you look good. Do not invite your friends or your relatives. They may pay you back someday. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite those who will not be able to pay you back, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. You will be blessed. You will actually be blessed because of their inability to repay you." And he says, "You will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." So we see Jesus here using strong language again to startle us out of our selfish, natural thinking. Is he saying that we should never invite our family and friends over? No. Of course he wants us to enjoy our family and our friends. Rather, I believe he is shining a light on the hidden ulterior motives that sometimes accompany our choices of who we spend our time with, of who we party with. Because often we will find our choices are all about us. What will bring me the maximum satisfaction? It's all about me. The world revolves around me and what brings me pleasure. So when I used to fantasize about Pope John Paul II coming to my party, it wasn't fantasizing about how his appearance at the party would bless everyone else. It was all about me and how great everyone would think I was. Oh, you know Pope John Paul II? Wow, you must be somebody special. And then, like Pinocchio's nose that starts to grow longer as he tells a lie, my head would start to get bigger. And soon, that big head wouldn't be able to get past St. Peter into and through the narrow gate into heaven. And I've said before that for the readings on Sunday, the church chooses the gospel, and then she chooses the first reading that has a connection to the gospel. And the gospel reading today, which records Jesus' words at a party, seem to be all about humility. So what does the first reading say? The first reading says, "My son, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than a giver of gifts." You'll be loved more than a giver of gifts. We love people who give us gifts, lots of gifts. He says you'll be loved more than a giver of gifts if you conduct your affairs with humility. It goes on to say, "Humble yourselves the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God." That's a pretty strong connection between the first reading and the gospel this weekend. But we know that attacking our sinful pride and becoming humble is difficult, right? And many of you have heard of the humility prayer, the dangerous prayer. If you haven't heard of it, Google it, look it up. But the good news is that we can become humble with God's help. Why? Because Jesus himself paved the way for us. He humbled himself. He emptied himself. And himself was able to open up and pass through that narrow gate in front of us. And all we have to do is follow our leader. So I urge you, don't wait until misfortune makes you humble. Don't wait until suffering and loss bring humility to your doorstep. Don't wait until your sin is exposed before the cameras before you learn humility. The saints hold up the model for us of acting right now, starting to chip away at our pride, asking God for help, practicing little acts of humility, conducting our affairs with humility, like those folks on the other side of the narrow gate.